So, introducing our featured guest this evening, I am so pleased to introduce the wonderful Carolyn Brody, owner of BookHampton. Take it away, Carolyn.
Dana, thank you, and welcome to everybody. This is a terrific turnout, so I couldn't be more pleased. We don't take we don't give awards for the highest attendance, but certainly virtually or in person, this is really one of the best. So thank you, and welcome to Paul Goldberger and to Kurt Andersen, who are here with us tonight to be in conversation about Paul's latest book, DUMBO, The Making of a Neighborhood and the Rebirth of Brooklyn. And I'm going to just hold this book up because it's gorgeous. It has incredible presence. It's a Rizzoli book, and we are so excited to have it just on the sort of the face of it alone. But it is remarkable because it celebrates the bringing to life of long neglected industrial buildings at the edge of Brooklyn. I'm sure many of you on the Zoom know this neighborhood. And ultimately it's been the creation of an entire neighborhood called DUMBO, which David Wallentis, and you'll hear more about him throughout this evening, says that the whole world wants to come to, and he's absolutely right. It was his vision, and it's a remarkable story, and really no one better to tell it than Paul Goldberger. It's a story, it's not your typical real estate story, far from it. And so this is, the text of it is really what happened from the beginning to the finish, and it's masterfully and engagingly told. It doesn't skip a beat, and it's not a page turner in the sense that it's a thriller, but it just makes you wanting to know more each time. And it's also remarkably a love story, and you'll hear more about that through the evening. Again, it's a love story about a place and to a place, but also about a family, David and Jane, and later on their son, Jed, and everything that they did to really bring this to life, to create it from their vision to something that is really one of the most lively parts of New York City. And it's especially poignant because it talks about and celebrates Jane's Carousel, the beautifully restored Jane's Carousel, which many of us know, and you'll hear that story. And last but not least, these are fabulous photographs. I actually was blown away. I had no idea until I opened it for the first time. They're exquisite and they're beautifully reproduced. And so just for the history of an area and the, the sort of the aesthetic appeal of a book, it's got everything. So I encourage you, I hope you'll buy it, and it's really a fabulous book. So quickly, Paul, many of you know, the Huffington Post is called the leading figure in architecture criticism. He's now a contributing editor at Vanity Fair. From 1997 to 2011, he served as architecture critic for The New Yorker, where he wrote the celebrated Skyline column. He holds the Joseph Urban Chair in Design and Architecture at the New School, formerly Dean of the Parsons School, and started his career at the New York Times, where in 1984, it seems so long ago now, Paul, doesn't it? Gosh, architecture.
What have you done lately?
I know, right? Was awarded the Pulitzer Prize for Distinguished Criticism. He is the author of many books. Most recently, we've had in the store Ballpark. That was 1 or 2 years ago. We still have it. It's a terrific book, and Frank Gare, and so on and so forth. So it's a delight to welcome him. And a treat, absolutely, for us an honor to have Kurt Andersen with us. He's the best-selling author of Fantasyland, How America Went Haywire, and the novels Heyday, Turn of the Century, and True Believers. He contributes to Vanity Fair and the New York Times, and was host and co-creator of Studio 360, the Peabody Award-winning public radio show and podcast. And this is sort of like in his spare time, writes for TV, film, and the stage, and co-founded Spy magazine, served as editor-in-chief of New York, and was a cultural columnist and critic for Time and the New Yorker. So this is a perfect partnership and a perfect pairing of viewpoints for tonight. And we are so grateful and appreciative to have you both here with us. And with that, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Caroline. It's a pleasure to be here and be doing this. And I just as you were speaking, I realized, and as I've been thinking about how old Dumbo is at this point, that Paul and I have really known each other exactly half my life. I don't know what fraction of Paul's life that is, but we've known each other a long time. He was because he was, as Caroline said, the Pulitzer Prize winning architectural critic of New York Times when I barged in and pretended to be an architectural critic, which I was for a decade or so at Time magazine, and it all began at a McDonald's in Orlando, Florida. That's where our friendship began.
You remember that story? That's one of my favorite stories, because it's right when my son Ben, who is now executive editor of Time magazine, as if just to sort of bring this whole thing into a very amazing full circle, was 5 years old. I brought him to Orlando, Florida, to the American Institute of Architects convention, and you and I were supposed to have dinner, and I had promised my 5-year-old son that he could choose where dinner was tonight. And I recall you being an extremely good sport when Ben said he wanted to be taken to McDonald's, and you went along and we had dinner at McDonald's.
And now Ben Goldberger is the first Brooklynite in your family, as far as I know, living a walking distance from Dumbo.
And you forgave me taking you to McDonald's for the first dinner we had. That's true. Actually,
anyway, I have the other reason that Caroline didn't mention, that I have some standing to talk about this book with Paul. This, by the way, absolutely gorgeous book. I know we're not supposed to call them coffee table books, but it's the most beautiful new coffee table book I've gotten in years. It's fantastic looking and smart and thoughtful and great. So
thank you.
Now that that's out of the way, but I have lived in Brooklyn for a little, not quite as long as I've known Paul Goldberger, but just about. And so I can.
You kind of made Brooklyn chic. I mean, you were
that was it. I sure did.
You went and everyone else followed. It's
Bam and me, really.
That's kind of the history that I remember, Kurt. It was you and Harvey Lichtenstein, and then everything else followed, right?
Something like that. But one of the things about this book, I mean, I obviously, by being a New Yorker all this time and living in Brooklyn, I was aware of Dumbo when it occurred, but what I certainly was not aware of until this gorgeous book and with its extraordinary visuals, I didn't know about the history. And now I'm fascinated by this guy who created it. Talk about him, who, by the way, in some kind of talk about circles, great grand circles, this guy, the paper box king, who's moved from Tribeca, which is not called Tribeca, to Dumbo, which was not called Dumbo. But talk about him and why it was built in the first place.
A guy before David Wallentis who invented Dumbo the first time, really.
Exactly.
That's exactly right. Well, actually, although if we're going to really talk about the history, which fascinated me too, I mean, the pre-Wallentis history, there's a whole other part of it that the book talks about before even Robert Gare, the cardboard box king, and that's the 18th and 19th century Dumbo. I mean, Dumbo, most of the land from the Fulton Ferry area to what became the Brooklyn Navy Yard, to the bay that became the Brooklyn Navy Yard, was owned by one family that was, let's just say that he was a major Tory during the Revolutionary War. He fled back to England when the war was won, and the state of New York seized the land and sold it to a family named Sands, who had started Sands Point. And they were very, I guess, active Long Island real estate developers. And they decided to start a little village. And the village was called Olympia. And it was a little waterfront village. And it never really succeeded, in part because this was early 19th century. And waterfronts were beginning to get very industrialized. And people didn't really want to live there anymore. And so the idea of creating a waterfront village came just a little too late, really. But it explains one of the most curious things about Dumbo, and those who know the neighborhood know that, the center of it is a short 3-block long street called Main Street. And why would there be something called Main Street, only 3 blocks long, sort of at the edge of Brooklyn, as opposed to where Flatbush Avenue is, or Atlantic Avenue, or something like that? And it's because that was the main street of Olympia, this tiny little village that sputtered along for a couple of decades in the early 19th century and then failed as the neighborhood became more and more industrial. But the guy you were referring to is a guy named Robert Gare, who was an immigrant from Scotland, incredibly hardworking, who more or less invented the corrugated foldable cardboard box and had a little factory in Lower Manhattan. And he was so successful, he outgrew it quickly, needed more space. And his friend was John Arbuckle of the U-Bahn Coffee Company, who had a warehouse in Brooklyn. And he said, come over here. He liked it. And he started, not only did he move his own business there, but he started buying more and more land and kept building after building. And this enormous collection of industrial buildings on the waterfront, almost all of which had been built by Robert Gare. So many, for years, people referred to the neighborhood as Gareville. And then in the 1920s, his company moved upstate New York. They moved again to get out of the city. And the buildings just became less and less active and more almost derelict. And that's when the whole, eventually the chapter I really focused the book on about, which was David Wallentis's discovery of this neighborhood.
And before we move on to that, though, I'm fascinated. I didn't realize, because you look at the buildings and who knows what they're made of or how they're made, but so many of them, the main ones are concrete, right?
Yep.
And that must have been a brand new technology in
Gare
1890, right?
Gare was obsessed with technology. Made him, I mean, I think it's one of the reasons he was an interesting character. The technology to make folding cardboard boxes he invented. He had one of the first industrial workspaces to have telephones everywhere, that sort of thing. And he also was obsessed with building technology. The first building he built out there, I think, was a wood frame with brick, like many industrial buildings in the late 19th century. But as he kept going, he got more and more interested in reinforced concrete, which was a new technology for building, and built the largest reinforced concrete building in the country, is one of the DUMBO buildings. And then he just kept going. And I think eventually built 7 or 8 large industrial buildings there.
And then, as you say, as industry slowly and then rapidly left New York City, and that became this little forgotten zone, made more forgotten when the great Robert Moses, of course, built the Brooklyn Queens Expressway and cut it off, as he did so many little pieces of New York by his expressways.
Right. This one was cut off, but of course, the thing that was cut off also had these extraordinary riverfront views. It was right on the river, but people paid no attention to it. Except, I guess you could say, the mob, which found it a useful place occasionally to dump bodies and things like that into the water. But basically, in the 50s and 60s, it was overlooked. At one point, the book tells this story too, the city considered moving the wholesale food market there from downtown Brooklyn. And that was stopped, actually, by
your predecessor.
My predecessor, Ada Louise Huxtable. Right,
Wow.
Exactly. It was a part of her career I'd forgotten until I re-encountered it researching this book, actually. And she said, this is this amazing piece of land, one of the last pieces of undeveloped significant waterfront land in the city, and you're not going to put a wholesale meat market there. She and the Brooklyn Heights Association, which was a very active community group that at that point, I guess, because DUMBO was not an entity, decided it could reach its it expanded its horizons to include it, and they managed to get it stopped. It was built, I think, eventually in Sunset Park, and so that left DUMBO effectively available, and then here we are.
Yeah, and so it really, as with so much, as Soho was becoming suddenly Soho and called Soho and becoming fancy even by the mid-late 70s when I moved to New York, DUMBO was still not, and Brooklyn certainly was not. But it seems like, and I'd forgotten, and it was good to be reminded of the history in this book, that really the seeds were River Cafe and barge music, this odd little classical music thing on the East River. That's right. And they both came along in the same time, right? 77.
The late 70s. It's exactly the time you're talking about. Soho had already happened, but hadn't yet sort of peaked. So Soho had not yet become a shopping mall.
It was still a little bohemian.
But it was still a little bohemian and definitely very cool, and still was filled with art galleries because they hadn't gone to Chelsea yet.
Yeah.
And David Wallentis, who is, I think it's fair to say, a lot more imaginative than the typical New York real estate developer, and who really, one of the reasons I like David is because he truly loves buildings as opposed to balance sheets. I mean, he actually really responds viscerally to them. And he was at that point, a developer of success, but not a major developer in New York. He had done a lot of one-shot projects, almost all of which had been architecturally interesting, though. He bought and redid the that extraordinary apartment building at 58th and 5th with the amazing ornate facade. He had done. You
mean not the one that Donald Trump tore down?
No. This one is very much still there.
Yeah.
He did what became known as the Silk Building, where Tower Records was,
which was down in what was not yet called Nolita.
Right, but it was at cutting edge. It was the cool
building of it.
He did 1 Fifth Avenue. So that, he found these kind of cool places and one by one did them. Yeah. And, but he was not sort of a major corporate developer.
Right.
And after as he was finishing the Silk Building, he went in there one day and as he tells the story, saw a kid in the elevator and said, "So what's the next place where everything's happening?" And the kid said, "Dumbo."
Yeah.
And David had never heard of it.
Yeah.
But the River Cafe had opened recently. He took the bridge, went across, had lunch at the River Cafe, and then after lunch, he just started walking. And his mind was blown by what he saw, which was derelict but beautiful. Actually, these incredible industrial buildings on empty streets with cobblestones.
Yes, which were not yet familiar as they were about to become, even before it became, this vast David Wallentis development and famous, but it became this set, right, for fashion shoots and advertising, and I remember in the early 80s that Sergio Leone movie Once Upon a Time in America was its poster. So it was sort of becoming discovered just as a picturesque, gritty urban,
just beginning to be.
Yeah.
And Wallentis, one of the other really smart things Wallentis did, I mean, he knew this was not going to happen overnight. He had an extraordinary patience. I don't think he thought it was going to take as long as it did, but he knew it was going to take a long time. And he knew also that culture really is, a kind of stimulus for neighborhoods. And he and his wife, Jane, essentially seeded the neighborhood with cultural facilities, many of which they gave space to either free or for a pittance, simply to get them there. And so instead of deciding that the artists and other people who had been more or less squatting in random space in Dumbo when he got there represented the enemy, he figured, all right, how can we kind of make something more of this, and then the other people will follow in time.
Yeah.
And that's ultimately what happened.
Yeah, but I think we should be clear, and you should. I've met David a few times, and you should talk about him. I mean, he is all credit due to him. This patience, this long-term commitment, his vision, all of it. He's also he's not like a pussycat or the kind of just a nice altruist who loves artists. All that's true, but he's a New York real estate guy, right?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. No. I mean, look, at the end of the day, he was in it to make money. He was not in it as an act of philanthropy.
Yeah.
Of course not. And the fact that he had the patience and the vision to sit it out does not mean that this was an act of altruism.
No, but again, it's different than so much of bad developer dumb and bad, frankly, American capitalism. His long-term view is admirable to me.
Merely being able to have a long-term view is the point. That's all. Yeah. And remember that when he took over Dumbo, it was not zoned for housing. It was not legal to use any of that stuff for housing. the best he could hope for was that they could take those old buildings that had been used, had random dying manufacturing businesses in some of them. A lot of the space was used for warehouses. A lot of it was empty altogether. And he tried to rent it as back office space for Wall Street. And he did sort of okay on and off for a while and got bailed out at one point by the state of New York when they moved the Labor Department from the World Trade Center into 1 Main Street in DUMBO, which rescued him from what might have been real disaster at one point. But none of that represented the kind of success that DUMBO would ultimately have.
Right.
Many years later when it was rezoned for residential living.
Right. No, I mean, how long it took is kind of extraordinary. Also, before we go on, I mean, I want you to, I mean, the DUMBO, it was barely, maybe he met this kid who said it, DUMBO, but DUMBO was really not even called DUMBO. I mean, I looked it up in your former newspaper, right. And even in the New York Times in like 1988, 1990, it wasn't necessarily or referred to as DUMBO. It was just, that waterfront district, or maybe Fulton
kind of
Fair.
Beginning to, yeah. I mean, for a while, actually, when Wallentis first tried to market it as office space, they called it Fulton Landing in reference to the end of Fulton Street and
right.
the ferry and all that stuff. And then there was a brief period before him when it was sort of called Gareville. Some of the city studies about traffic and that meat market and other stuff referred to it as the Two Bridges neighborhood, which nobody ever took seriously, or nobody other than a couple of bureaucrats ever used that. But there were a lot of different names. DUMBO was actually created mainly by the early settlers there, thinking it would keep real estate developers
as a joke, right?
The name was so ridiculous.
Yeah, it's like a parody of Soho in Tribeca.
Right. It was a parody of Soho, and they figured nobody's going to invest in a place with a name this obviously stupid. And named that's going to remind people of an elephant or whatever.
Yes.
So, and in the end, it it didn't play out quite that way.
And it was interesting again to see in the book how to be reminded how long he kept at it. I mean, he started buying 79, 80 around there, and I mean, there were no commercial galleries for a while. One opened, one it closed. I mean, it wasn't just suddenly kaboom. I have created DUMBO. It was
no. It was
a very long-term thing. And so my question is, at what point did he decide? Okay, this is not touch and go, but this is going to be a long slog. When did he embrace the idea? And by the way, you should talk about his wife, who, as you say, was crucial to this whole operation. Not the brains of the operation, but essential to it. But when did he decide, okay, I'm in it for, this is my life's work, really?
I think it was gradual. I think he'd always hoped it was going to play out as it did, but there were a couple of points when I think he was pretty close to ready to pack it in. As the commercial thing never quite worked, he also had a few really big setbacks. I mean, remember
Ed Koch didn't like him.
Ed Koch hated him, and mainly because Ken Lipper, Ed Koch's deputy mayor for economic development, hated him and got him de-designated as the official developer for a portion of DUMBO that the city and state were going to support. And there were the long ups and downs of the Brooklyn Bridge Park, which happened only, in very recent years. There was the greatest landmark architecturally there is the extraordinary old warehouse called the Empire Stores, which is immortalized in a great Berenice Abbott photograph of it. And Wallentis tried for years to redevelop that. That's owned by the state of New York and never got the permission to, came close a couple of times. Ultimately, it's now finally been done and has all these stores and restaurants and things, but he didn't do it, somebody else did it. But in a way, it's all just as well, because you don't really want a real city neighborhood to have solely the imprint of one developer, one man, whatever.
Absolutely.
And then it becomes Disneyland, it becomes artificial. And in fact, I think the miracle of DUMBO is that it's gentrification without as much artifice as invariably comes along with gentrification, and particularly would have if it had been 100% Wallentis.
Totally. Well, it also, it's gentrification without large numbers of poor non-white people being displaced because nobody was there, right?
That's the other reason that this is, a happier story than a lot, because there was no displacement to speak of. That's right.
And his vision, I mean, obviously, and I'm going to talk about it versus Soho and Tribeca and Metropolitan Soho, but he had, I mean, he didn't over control it. He wasn't the only owner, isn't the only owner, but he did have a vision that, for instance, as you talk about, he didn't want, like the rest of New York City and Manhattan especially, CVS's everywhere. He wanted to maintain as best he could a kind of mom and pop authenticity.
Which is, you're absolutely right, and that's why they kind of seeded it not just with cultural things, but they gave Jacques Torres a storefront when he was just starting his chocolate business. They certain things like that, slightly more artisanal, food related or other things that were unique businesses, they gave rent breaks to just to get them there and give the neighborhood a different feeling. And they also were not super restrictive about graphics and design. So for example, when a Korean food market, which is one of the very first food outlets in Dumbo, they allowed to put a kind of crappy sign that looked not different from the one that a Korean market might put somewhere else, as opposed to saying, no, this is Dumbo and such and such a font and such a kind of metal and all that. They knew enough to sort of stand back and say, you know what, there's a sense of authenticity to letting something be a little off, that in the long run is actually better for the neighborhood.
Right. Yes. And yes, not too twee and
not too twee. Exactly.
The other thing it isn't, I mean, it's interesting to look at them as, or think about them as, here's one way to do it, here's the other way to do it. Of course, at the same time that Dumbo was being created, was Battery Park City.
Yes.
And I don't hate Battery Park City, but it's kind of to me. And again, it's not one architect, but it is certainly a government jurisdiction, and effectively it is not the way it is. I mean, obviously there was nothing there, so they had to build it from scratch. But it's a very interesting simultaneous counterpoint to me.
It's interesting. I hadn't really thought of it that way. I thought of those two things as being at the same time, but of course they are. I mean, Dumbo had the great advantage of all of those, the Gare buildings, this inventory of huge, big industrial buildings that meant it was always going to feel, it was always going to have a different kind of streetscape from something like Battery Park City, which, the thing that's wrong about Battery Park City is nothing's wrong with it. That's what's wrong with it. It's just a little too right. And
it's a little Toronto.
It's not right. It's urban design out of a textbook, and as opposed to sort of letting it happen. I'm really interested in the whole dynamic between accident and intention in the making of cities. And in Battery Park City, the problem is there's not enough accident. In Dumbo, there's the happy accident of the history of these huge buildings. And then also, don't underestimate the amazing power and beauty and even awe of two of the greatest pieces of infrastructure that have ever existed anywhere, framing it. And I don't mean the BQE. Obviously, it's the Brooklyn Bridge on one side and the Manhattan Bridge on the other, with this, these incredible monumental Beaux-Arts arches under the Manhattan Bridge that are really part of the neighborhood and give it a whole tone too, that are not something you would find anywhere else at all.
It's almost
the river too.
Yes.
So.
Well, and it's almost, I mean, I remember being somewhat surprised that it did work, because I thought, like, really, are people going to want to buy these multi-million-dollar apartments, 50 feet from this constant hum of those two bridges? But yes, is the answer.
Eventually, yes. Although one of the best stories of the early years, the Ronald and Leonard Lauder, who were friends because Jane Wallentis, in the days back when she worked at a career, was an art director at Estee Lauder and became friendly with the Lauder family. And the Lauders invested in some of Wallentis's early projects. And David Wallentis took Leonard Lauder to see the site when he was still trying to put together the money to buy it. And Leonard Lauder listened to the traffic and the subways coming off the Brooklyn Bridge and essentially said, "Are you crazy? Nobody is going to want to be here at all. That sound is horrible." Eventually, he was persuaded to change his mind, and they gave him 50% of the money he needed to buy the buildings, but not the first go round he did.
Yeah. No, I mean, Soho had happened, starting in the 60s and then became what its current self, as we say, in the late 70s. So this is kind of, I mean, he David Wallentis and Jane had Soho as a kind of playbook, a template from which to work, right? So what, I mean, they obviously, I mean, it is kind of a Soho 2.0.
Yeah.
Right. And so did they learn lessons that they said, oh, let's do this, let's not do this, based on what had happened the previous generation of Soho and then Tribeca and Nolita and all the rest?
Well, Soho was much more, Soho was kind of retail. By retail there, I don't mean actual stores. I mean one by one buildings.
Right.
Different developers each did one project here and there. Maybe somebody did 2 or 3 in sequence. Suddenly, DUMBO, you were dealing with it wholesale because he had all these buildings, and you can't do it exactly the same.
Right.
And remember also, there was, while it has these extraordinary views that Soho doesn't have, and it has the bridges and all that stuff, it's also, still a subway ride away. It's farther away than Soho from other.
You mean away from where you live in Uptown Manhattan?
But not from not from Brooklyn Heights, not from where you live, not from Vinegar Hill, not from Fort Greene.
But yes, of course, when Manhattan was still much more central.
Remember, this is 1979,
right? When
nobody was lending money for anything.
Well, and I just wanted to make the point.
Pretty grim.
I mean, as late as the turn of the century, in the early 2000s, taxis would refuse to take me home to Brooklyn because it was Brooklyn. So I mean, this whole Brooklyn, oh yeah, Brooklyn now. I mean, which as I was reading the book reminded me of what a big, what a kind of long shot it was. I mean, it wasn't obvious that the Brooklyn Renaissance would happen.
No, it wasn't. I mean, it was beginning to happen in a very limited way. And certainly, Carroll Gardens, people were beginning to
Park Slope, obviously, yeah.
But Park Slope had been for a while.
Yeah.
But that was mostly it, and it was still, we were a really long way from Bushwick. We were, we were a long way from, even Cobble Hill was not a big thing in those days. No, and nobody lived downtown Brooklyn. Nobody would go near.
Right. I mean, it's interesting to think of it again. How is it like and unlike Greater Soho, which with that whole Lower Manhattan? One way is it is full of, certainly these days, new buildings as well as these old 1890s buildings that we talked about, right? I mean, there's a lot of new buildings.
DUMBO.
Oh, DUMBO.
DUMBO, yes.
Unlike Soho.
And they're right. And they're a mixed bag, the new buildings there, I think. I mean, there's one small development firm called Alloy that has done beautiful small buildings that are sort of inserted elegantly into DUMBO that I think are really, really good. And
done beautiful renovations and repurposing.
And beautiful, right, exactly. Yeah. And I mean, they represent sort of the highest DUMBO has achieved in terms of new architecture, I would say. And then there are a couple of really mediocre buildings that developers have dropped in there to take advantage of the fact that DUMBO has become chic.
Yeah.
Wallentis has done one large new building called 60 Water Street.
Which is not bad.
Which is okay, which I think I put as not as good as the Alloy buildings, but certainly better than anything else that's large.
Yeah.
New in the neighborhood, I agree. And it's a mixed bag, but you see, it's the old Gare buildings still kind of anchor the neighborhood and become the core, and nothing really can change that.
Yeah,
which is I think important and good.
Yeah, no, and in whether David Wallentis sort of saw that in a flash or just intuited it or understood that over time. It's a great blank slate with which to work in its combination of, kind of motley accident and room for new. It's not just a perfect twee old neighborhood.
It's a great blank slate in part because it could never be truly blank. It's always, part of it's filled in, and then it's a question of filling in the rest. And also, look, we're also very lucky that in the end, the right thing happened on the waterfront too. I mean, Wallentis, actually, one of his major schemes at one point was this plan he commissioned from the architect Jean Nouvel to do a huge waterfront hotel that would have been on a pier and blocked the Manhattan Bridge.
Yeah, parallel, sort of adjacent to and parallel with the Manhattan Bridge.
Right, exactly. I mean, Nouvel is an extraordinary architect and capable of great things. I've never believed that was one of them, however. And, my successor at the New York Times, Herbert Mouchamp, adored it. I think it served to establish that Wallentis was very serious about doing more than just renovating a few old factories.
Right.
In that sense, it was good. It also established the relationship with Nouvel that ultimately led to Nouvel designing something much smaller, but also much better, which is the beautiful glass enclosure for the carousel on the waterfront. So, it was just as well that it was commissioned, but also just as well that it never went ahead, I think.
Yeah. One thing that I'd never thought of before, but reading your book and looking at the pictures and thinking about DUMBO is that, it's the most Manhattan-y part of New York City outside of Manhattan. Do you know? I mean, the density, the height, the new buildings and the old buildings together, all of it is like, there's nothing, it's very un-Brooklyn-y, certainly.
It's interesting you say that. I mean, I wonder if maybe, this is terrible to say, if that's one reason I viscerally respond so positively to it. I don't know. I mean, it definitely. And
maybe I don't quite as much as Ursula.
It's definitely not brownstone Brooklyn. That's for sure.
No. It's cool. It's cool.
Right. Yeah. But on the other hand, one of the other really nice things about it is, because it isn't that big, you can walk through it quickly, and then you walk just a few blocks and you're in the middle of Brooklyn Heights.
Yeah.
Or you go in the other direction to Vinegar Hill,
which I love. Vinegar Hill is a tiny little place, and people haven't been there. They should visit Vinegar Hill.
Where we've had dinner at in Vinegar Hill. It's so that you're right near those sort of classic parts of Brooklyn. Yeah. But you're right; it does feel kind of industrial. It also feels, in a weird way, there's a part of it. I think it's Prospect Street, which is the area that sometimes is called DUMBO Heights, right on the edge of it, where Estee's headquarters are, and those buildings. Some of the buildings, by the way, some of the ones that were not taken over by Wallentis became part of the Jehovah's Witnesses holding.
Of course, and all the way down the river,
right, and are now converted to other uses. And there's a street there just before you turn onto the bridge. It sort of reminds me of a little part of San Francisco near the ramps and turn to the Oakland Bay Bridge. There, also near the waterfront. There's a period of just a few blocks south of Market and close to the bridge. It feels a little bit like that.
And you say that it's small and obviously can't grow any bigger because of the nature of, unless we tear down the BQE, which I don't think we're going to in your lifetime or mine. But it's interesting that, I mean, we spoke before about what expressways and Robert Moses did so often, which is to wall off poor people in neighborhoods. Right. Here, it walled off this nothing neighborhood that now has walled off rich people. It's I mean, and there's some, it isolates it a bit as a neighborhood, but it also makes it, I don't know, kind of a jewel box, I guess,
Yeah, I mean, one saving grace, I suppose, is that the particular route of the BQE, which is odd, it does not cut it off from the public housing at the edge of Vinegar Hill, so that you have, in the same way that adjacent to the High Line are the NYCHA Chelsea houses, which assure that no matter what else happens, there is definitely a range of income in the neighborhood. Yes. the fact that you have all of this adjacent to it and increasingly thought of as if not the heart of Dumbo, still Dumbo, I think is actually helpful and good long range for the neighborhood, and the whole Navy Yard development and all that has begun to kind of make connections to Dumbo, which again, I think is a good thing.
One of the other things your book is a case study on just how, to me, because it isn't my temperament, horrifically difficult real estate development in New York City is. I mean, and again, it's a singular thing, what he's done, as we've said, and this vision he had, and he's stuck with it. But my God, I mean, not just Ken Lipper hating you, but all of the ups and downs and disappointments, and I mean, it really takes a special kind of temperament, which he has. But my question is to you is,
you and I as writers presumably don't have, right?
Well, you know,
right.
Yeah. I mean, New York, as people have said, of various parts of the ideological spectrum have said, is very difficult to build in now, and that has good reasons for that and bad reasons, and good effects and bad effects. It struck me as, in this case, the Democratic Community Board, Brooklyn Heights Association, all of it kind of worked okay, as long as you had a David Wallentis willing to endure it for 40 years.
I think that's probably right. And also because you had David Wallentis, who is, you know, an assertive developer who, as I said, is as interested in making money as anybody else, but really did want to do the right thing and was not going to throw in the towel, and pushed back. But, you know, the more reasonable community people understood that he was not the complete and total enemy. I mean, there were a few that were always going to consider him,
even though he's a landlord.
Even though he's a landlord. And there were always a few who could not negotiate with any real estate developer because that's like negotiating with a terrorist in their view. But the sort of, you know, there was a place in the middle where they could meet, and eventually, you know, I mean, and there were a lot of smaller stories within that, like years of battle over St. Anne's Warehouse, you know, the theater company.
Yes.
That
it was a tobacco warehouse, right?
It was a tobacco warehouse in the developing Brooklyn Bridge Park, which Wallentis, you know, did not fully control.
Yeah.
And he was trying to support St. Anne's Warehouse, which he had given space to. And then as St. Anne's Warehouse, when St. Anne's Warehouse had to move because Wallentis was building the 60 Water Street building on that site, the best place for them was this old ruin of a warehouse inside the park. But there were those who thought that was Wallentis's building a new home for St. Anne's Warehouse in the park was barely different from Wallentis saying, I'm going to put condos in the park.
Yeah.
And so, you know, they were fighting it, and St. Anne's Warehouse and he, in that case, were mostly on the same side. And ultimately it did eventually happen. And it's also a very beautiful design. But it took a long time to get people to agree because it was technically a change in the plan for the park. And so therefore, you know, it did require amendments to the original intention of the park. And there were those who said, no, you know, we're not going to give an inch to anything that is even remotely connected to any commercial developer, however peripherally. I mean,
and to me, as a Brooklynite, St. Anne's Warehouse is the greatest achievement practically of Dumbo in terms of the culture. And again, the story that you tell in the book of that, and you've just summarized, is why I could never be in this business. I would have walked away so many times during that, you know, agita-filled episode. Now you mentioned, I mean, the Brooklyn Bridge Park, but you know, and of course the second part of the subtitle of your book is The Rebirth of Brooklyn. But we're really talking about this chunk of Brooklyn.
Yeah, we're not trying to really talk about all of Brooklyn.
But it strikes me, as I've watched and walked around the last decade, what has happened south of the Brooklyn Bridge, the parks, the buildings, and all the rest, which is really an extraordinary thing that I don't think would have happened had David Wallentis not made Dumbo what it was. It seems like, I mean, I know they were talking about it for years, doing something and building something, but what has happened along the river there from, you know, south from past Atlantic now up to Front Street is not all due to Dumbo, but Dumbo kind of said, yeah, look, this can really be an attractive new kind of waterfront New York.
Dumbo definitely helped a lot. I mean, it was beginning to happen anyway because the Port Authority wanted to dispose of the piers, and there was a long pre-Dumbo history of studies and political fighting about what would happen on the Brooklyn waterfront in that area. It is, I think, as much as Dumbo itself is one of those cases of things, the process having been incredibly long, incredibly arduous, and yet in the end, somehow coming out almost better than we deserved, given everything, actually.
No, I couldn't agree with you more. And no, and you know, people were talking for years and decades, you know, since we've both been here about, oh, New York needs to return to its waterfront. Well, here it really did in an extraordinary way that, and again, as you said before, that wasn't done by one developer or one Robert Moses, and wasn't done overnight. The fact that it took a while made it more, dare I say it, real, you know?
Yeah. And actually, you know, I mean, the person who I think really did the most to pull everything together there was Regina Meyer, who ran the Brooklyn Bridge Park Conservancy for a long time at its point of really, you know, fully achieving maturity and the most important stuff happening. And she did work closely with Wallentis, actually, and help, you know, make a lot of those things happen. I mean, she was one of those people who was willing to push Wallentis where necessary and deal with him where it could work, and did successfully.
Yeah. And really, since it took, and this is my last question, then we'll open it to the audience, but it really took off, I guess, and you know, at the end of the 90s, that's when it's sort of, okay, this is really happening. And in the last 20 years has been when it's obviously he's become a billionaire. Does he, I mean, at one point he must have been the dominant owner of Dumbo, and now he presumably no longer is, David?
Well, I think he's still the dominant owner. He's not the dominant builder. Because his company now, largely because of the success of Dumbo, has gone on to a lot of other stuff at large scale, and they're really building, you know, a huge amount on the Williamsburg waterfront.
Just kept going up the river. Yeah, exactly.
Just kept going up the river. And they've left the individual sites to Dumbo, to other people, for I think two different reasons. One is that now they are a big company, the very thing they didn't used to be. And, you know, a single building at moderate scale is not something they devote as much time to anymore.
Right.
And secondly, he also, though, really does believe that Dumbo is probably better off with diversity of architecture, diversity of ownership, as well as other kinds of diversity. And so that's what's happened. I think they probably, in terms of square feet, though, I think they still do control more of it than anybody else. Their headquarters is in Dumbo and remains so. And David Wallentis lives in Dumbo.
Well, that's the other thing we should have said from the start, is that he actually lives there. I mean, which is
there. And yeah, and you know, his wife, who sadly died last summer, but was an extraordinary presence and critical to so much that was done in Dumbo all the time, quietly behind the scenes, pushing him often in the right direction, actually, and chronicling and archiving most of what happened in Dumbo, as well as designing a lot of it herself as an art director. And I mean, David really does correctly say that without Jane, it could not have happened. And, but, you know, and her great life project was restoring this old carousel, which they enclosed in this Jean Nouvel enclosure and is in Brooklyn Bridge Park, and is now, was always called Jane's Carousel. Now, you know, sadly, it's a memorial to her, really, in a way, too.
Well, if we were going to go have dinner now, we could keep talking, but we're not, alas. But soon, I hope.
Okay, well,
but if there are
a couple of other people, if there are any questions, I guess.
We do have some questions rolling in here, and just a reminder for our audience, if you have questions, send them on over in the Zoom chat box. First, for Paul and Kurt, do you know if Liz Holtzman was a friend to these endeavors?
I actually have no idea.
I'm not even sure. I don't. It's funny. I just interviewed Liz Holtzman for something else recently. I was asking her about Vietnam, and Nixon, not about this. I'm not sure it was even in her district. But anyway, I'm unaware of it.
Don't know.
Next question. Book recommendations. In this case, book recommendations about the evolution of New York, maybe vis-a-vis real estate or architecture.
Oh,
Who wants to go
I'll
first?
give one. I'll give one while Paul's thinking. There's a brand new book by Tom Diger called New York, New York, New York, that is both encyclopedic history of the last 40 years of New York City, but also beautifully written, which is a rare combination of encyclopedic and beautifully
I'm in the
written.
middle of reading that myself, actually, and I would agree. It's a remarkable book. Also, to read the history of the last 40 years as, you know, history, the time we all lived through, is sort of amazing. I mean, it's remarkable. It's not particularly an architecture book, although he's interested in architecture and probably gives a fair amount of attention to it. It's not in any way primarily about
No,
that.
but if you're interested in New York City, it's a book.
Yes.
It's a good
Yeah,
book, yeah.
It's certainly the best book of very recent New York City history. Yeah, by far.
I know you both spoke a bit about this, but there's a question. In your opinion, is there a perfect balance of merging old with new and preserving what was there and also building on the new ideas?
It depends on, there's no formula. And it depends particularly on the nature of what the old thing is. And also about urban fabric as well as individual landmarks. You know, I mean, Kurt mentioned correctly that, you know, one of the appealing things about DUMBO is just the feel of the streets and the fact that those old buildings created that. And that they create an ensemble in which the whole is more than the sum of the parts. Many of the parts are not that extraordinary, but they come together to make an extraordinary place. Certain other neighborhoods, though, you may find, you know, an individual extraordinary building. You know, when an existing fabric is as good as DUMBO, or in a very different way, as good as Brooklyn Heights or Park Slope, you know, you want to treat it very delicately and very carefully. It doesn't mean you can't have new things, but it means they have to be inserted with enormous care and precision. Other neighborhoods are often, you know, not as good and don't call for quite that surgery of quite that sort.
And one thing I like about DUMBO and about neighborhoods near where I am in Gowanus and Carroll Gardens and Western Park Slope, I guess, is there are lots of interesting new small buildings, essentially townhouses and small apartment buildings, stuck into these areas that aren't quite so perfect as, say, Brooklyn Heights. And in terms of blending in a little bit of new and sometimes weird with the old, works very nicely in these, you know, grittier neighborhoods, which obviously DUMBO was and to some degree still is.
And I would say the same about Williamsburg, actually.
Yeah. There's a lot of nice, ugly buildings.
Right. There's a lot of old ugly and a lot of old nice and a lot of new ugly and a lot of new nice.
Yeah.
And it's kind of all thrown together to create a far less ordered combination than we have either in DUMBO in one way or Brooklyn Heights in another. But I like it anyway.
Yeah. And which, by the way, yeah, I mean, it's what we're just talking about there. It's another reason why many of us think, you know, Brooklyn is in that way too the beating heart of New York City in the way that perhaps Manhattan isn't anymore. But anyway, that's just my Brooklyn evangelism speaking.
Well, I'm going to take a last question here. And Paul, is there a next book in the works for you? What are you working on?
Working on a couple of different things, actually. But one of them is a kind of long-term project on an idea that we've touched on tonight, which is just the whole dynamic and the balance between accident and intention in cities. And is there a way to ever achieve that balance, or is it just a matter of luck and happenstance? And some of the very best things that have ever happened in cities have been by accident. But on the other hand, if you laissez-faire is no way to plan cities, that's a disaster. So, and yet places that are often too planned can be deadly. So how do you navigate between those things? That's an idea that particularly interests me, and I'm trying to give it shape into a book. But it's a little ways away. Kurt turns out a book a year. I'm not sure I can.
I certainly do not, but that sounds fantastic to me. I can't wait to read that, because as you know, I had to skip the last one because I have no interest whatsoever in baseball. I love this one, and I intend to love the next. That one.
Well, and I love Kurt's last book called Evil Geniuses is the most extraordinary summary of how we got to the mess we're in the part of this country that is not DUMBO, that I have read. So I urge everyone to read that as well.
Thank you.
Kurt, do you have something in the works?
I have this podcast about Nixon and Vietnam that's coming out in June called Nixon at War, which everyone should listen to when it drops. And I have the beginnings of a book that I'm just too early to even talk about. But yeah, I do have something in the works.
Fantastic. Well, we're already at that time, but Paul and Kurt, thank you so very much. It's been an honor having you with us tonight. Everyone, DUMBO, The Making of a New York Neighborhood. It's available now online and in store. Please get your copies while supply lasts. While supplies last. Thank you to all of our guests for being with us. And as always, thank you for supporting your local independent bookstores. Happy reading all, and have a wonderful night.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks, Kurt.
My pleasure. It was great. It's like a real conversation.
A real conversation. I know. Someday we'll even have one in the same room.
Yeah, exactly.